Chapter 13. Anne dreaded the following weekend. Apparently, Ian had manipulated things yet again, ensuring she would be able to come. Sharon had somehow won a weekend getaway for a family of 3 to Orlando. To be polite, George said he would try to find a way to bring Anne, but she had smiled and thanked him and declined. "I'll be fine, Mr. Tallow, truly. I have friends I've been meaning to spend more time with, and this is the perfect opportunity." "If you're sure, there's no hardship to make arrangements." She had been firm but polite, and had locked up the house, magical and mundane, the moment they were gone, going to the curb to meet the car that pulled up for her. Someone held the door open for her and guided her into the back, taking her small overnight case and putting it in the trunk. She sat in silence, dreading the odd vertigo she always felt in these contraptions. She knew she was moving and could feel something like movement, but at the same time she couldn't, and did not like it at all. She had brought her book with her to distract her from the lightheadedness, and now pulled it from the small bag at her side and opened it. She had written in it this week, the first time in a while, and what she had written bothered her more than a little. It was not one of the poems she dreaded, the ones that heralded bad things, but it was disturbing to her nonetheless. She ran her hand over the page, making the words spring to life before her eyes, and reread them again, trying to reassure herself that it was not the maudlin, angsty, badly written poetry of the lovesick. Caught in the breath of winter, I sit in the rose bower, surrounded by thorns, waiting for the roses to bloom. I sit and wait, my heart full of thorns, my fate hanging on an unkind word. Fragile my butterfly heart, waits ill-patient for spring and the coming change. Still wind, no word spoken, I die unchanged. Unloved, I die forgotten. The second mention of thorns bothered her, but she could not think of something to replace it with. She knew for certain then that this was not one of those poems. Those poems always hit the page the way they were meant to be. She felt the vehicle slowing and looked up, saw the wall that surrounded the rest by the wards and other enchantments that made most folk pay it no mind. In no time at all they were pulling up to the front of the manor, and Capine led her over to the spot she had marked months ago. She stood there, looking up at the house she could sense by its shadow, and sighed. There was something about this place that made her feel stable, something the world outside the wall lacked. The driver handed her bag to Celaine, who trotted out to meet them. Celaine was overjoyed to see Anne. "I'll put this in your room," she crowed, running back inside as Shannon came out and glared at her. Shannon took Anne's hand and led her more slowly into the house. "Welcome home, dear," she smiled, patting the top of Anne's hand. "Everything's the way it were when you left us." Anne took a deep breath as she entered the cool interior of the front room. The fragrance of roses and lilies welcomed her, along with the hint of magnolia from the solar to her right. Even Shannon smelled as she always did, of furniture polish and lemons and sachets. There was comfort here. "Thank you, Shannon. You're a dear." The older woman chuckled. "Oh, 'tis not my duty. Not often I get them come back." This reminded Anne. "How is your frog Prince doing?" "Fairly useful. His manners are much better, and he's a great help around the house. He can get to places I can't without a ladder. He's looking more normal, though. I don't know what it is about the change. Some, like poor Danny, never go back to being human enough to walk among men. Some alter by fits and starts. Some, like the O'Keefe, can change back and forth and in between at will. Not sure yet which he'll be." Anne's laugh came easy, and she began to wonder why she had been so against coming. "You'll sort him out if anyone can." The woman's thanks was translated through the squeeze of her hand, but she said nothing of it. "Most everyone is out back, and some are right eager to see you." Any further questions were forestalled by Anne stepping out the back door onto the great veranda. There were things she could see out here. She walked forward, unaware of when Shannon had let her go, and slipped quietly back inside. There were banners draped and streamers wrapped around nearly everything in a riot of reds and golds and ambers. Banners and streamers that she could see, wrapped around things she could not. She laughed with joy and crossed to the rail, easily avoiding the rows of chairs and rockers which were each marked with a glamoured ribbon. There had been some changes to the field since she had been gone. She could tell the places where the bonfires normally stood by the motions of the few taken piling the wood. Beyond that, in a place that was nearly the center of everything without getting in the way of the battlefield, was a permanent bandstand, draped in gold fanned banners. Raven came up to her while she was standing there taking it all in. It was Roulette's idea. She looked over, feeling relaxed and the beginning of herself for the first time in over a century. What were? The streamers. They had some left over from various parties at courts, but they were all different colors and none of them enough to do much anything with, so Liberty decided to glamour them to the color we wanted. Voila! You can see them. Then Roulette got the idea to wrap them around everything so you could see what's where. Sweet, huh? Anne wasn't sure what that was supposed to mean, but she smiled. It is very effective and quite lovely, thank you. Listen, she began. Something in her childlike voice told Anne the subject was not one she was comfortable with. I've heard a rumor you conducted things. She said it all in a rush, like one long word in an attempt to get it out before her courage failed her. Been talking to Danny, I see, she answered, her smile softening. I do. I have this ring. It was a gift, and I'm worried what it could do. That it could be telling on me? She said, unsure, once more childlike. The one on your right hand? She asked. It was the one she had noticed the day she met the girl. A shy nod was her answer. And how did you come by it? She examined it without touching it, eyeing it warily. Raven's voice was soft, almost not heard. The Red Queen put it on my hand herself. Said it was our promise, and I worry. Anne set her hand on the girl's shoulder. I'll talk to it. There she is, Roulette exclaimed and ran over from around the side of the house. Solitaire was on her heels. Anne, welcome back! You're needed in the Queen's private quarters, she crowed, taking the steps 2 at a time. Excuse us, Raven, Solitaire said. Though I think you can come too. She wants all the women. Well, Roulette corrected, most of the reliable ones. You, specifically, she said, pointing at Anne. She and her sister each took an arm and began to pull her back into the house. Raven laughed and followed, having some idea what was going on. Can I at least ask why? I was told I'd have no official duties today, Anne protested, though she was laughing. Can't say, said Roulette. Not here, chirped her twin. Too much testosterone. Too much what? Anne asked, beginning to feel like a badminton bird looking from one sister to the other. Men, Raven supplied. Oh. In short order, Anne found herself in a room full of women, most of whom were mortal. Liberty was presiding over them with Gabby at her side. Liberty lit up when she saw the quartet enter. At last! Now we can start. All right. Gilly, give on your chair, on you, please. It's easier for her to get to. Don't want her tripping over the lot of you trying to find one. With only a little grumbling, Gilly stood, taking Anne's hand and guiding her into the chair in her place. Now, with that settled, Liberty began with glee. Roulette? The door? Roulette grinned evilly, going to the door and laying her hands on it. Suddenly, the entire room, wall to wall, surged with electricity. There was a yelp from the next room, and several of the women giggled. Roulette smiled, leaning back against the door and maintaining a lower level of the current to discourage further eavesdropping. All right. Yule is not that far off. Most of you know the tradition. We hold a winter's mask every year, and it's going to take us this long to manage the costumes. This year, we're going in with a plan. Liberty stepped back and let Gabby take over. Every year for the last 12, our Holly King has gone rutting among the ladies, trying to root out his queen. He's got to find her afore the Oak King does, or he'll be at a disadvantage come the battle. That's tradition. If he succeeds, we get a longer winter. If he fails, spring comes early, or so they say. And let me tell you from experience, that's the way it's always gone. Well, this year, the horny bastard has been bragging and laying bets as to how long it'll take him. And he's betting short. Claims he has a way of finding the real queen, and I suspects he thinks the crown will give her away. How are we to circumvent that? Someone asked. Not to mention that it's not that hard to tell which of us are touched and which not. Liberty grinned like a Cheshire. I've paid a visit to the witch. She was more than happy to help. She glared at someone on the floor. And no, she didn't charge me my firstborn, she snapped. Superstitious shite, she added in a mumble. A glint appeared in her eye. She just wanted a few special things. Now, she's going to give me a box of charms, which we need to work into our masks or costumes. It doesn't have to be seen, but it does have to be there. They'll go active at noon on Yule and will last until midnight. What they'll do is give all of us the same glimmer of glamour. This brought a spate of laughter. It will make us all equally magical in seeming. Even Anne wouldn't be able to tell us apart. Mine will suppress the crown. But if they see our costumes before then, they'll know who's who, one woman complained. That's why we're going to work on them in secret, Roulette grinned. We have a place set up where only we can go, and we can work on the masks and costumes, and not even your husbands will know who you are. The conversation devolved at that point into plans of who was going to be what, when they were going to get the materials, and when each of them could come over to work on costumes. Anne began to tune them out. She was thinking, her mind turning over in veins she was hard-pressed to stop. She was finally rescued when Raven touched her arm. "Aye, dear?" she asked. "The ring?" Anne glanced around the room, then at the ring. "This is hardly the place for that. Perhaps we should go to my chamber?" She rose and followed the excited Raven girl from the room, stepping carefully in her wake to avoid people. Because some had stood and were moving about, it was less successful than usual. They were finally clear of the room and headed down the hall when she realized she did not know what room she had been put in. Bethany's voice came from the stairs. "There you are! Danny, I found her!" Raven sighed, realizing it wasn't happening now either. "Bethany?" Anne asked. "What?" She didn't have time to finish her question before the girl was on her and drawing her towards the stairs. Her excitement was infectious, even though it made Anne suspicious. She turned to Raven as she reached the stairs. "I'll take care of it, I promise." She turned to Bethany. "Can't this wait?" "Not can't," Danny injected, coming up to the other side of her and gingerly taking her arm. Between the two of them, she had no choice. They carried on a conversation over her head. "Should we drive or walk?" Danny asked. "It's not far, and like as not she'll be walking back and forth, so let's take her the route she'll take to get there," Bethany answered. In spite of her protest, neither one of them would explain as they took her out the back door and across the lawn towards the Rath. It wasn't until they were on the path through the woods and past the fairy fort that Anne stopped, forcing them to tell her or she wouldn't take another step. Danny sighed. "Sky's longhouse is done. He wants you to see it." There was a prickling within that told her, while the words were not a lie, they were not the answer to her question. She gave him the look, the one that had quailed elven princes. He swallowed and opened his mouth. Bethany warned him before he said anything. "Don't even try to lie to her." He shut his mouth. "Please, Miss Anne, it's a surprise for you, and if we tell you, it will spoil it. It's not much further, I promise." Anne felt nothing. She could tell they were both very pleased with whatever surprise they had for her and keen to show her. She relented. "Very well, but I do not wish to miss the festivities." "Oh, you won't," Beth assured her. She took Anne's arm, and the three of them proceeded down the wide path through the wood. They had only gone another 100 yards or so when the wood opened up. Not far from where they walked, Anne could see a door standing in the middle of nothing. She frowned, tilting her head. "Why is there a magical door in the middle of—" She stopped, realizing that the building it was attached to was of course mundane. "That's the door to Sky's Longhouse," Danny said, veering her off from it slightly. "I'll explain why you can see it in a bit. You'll be able to see some of the inside because I had to do some special things in there. The building itself was easy and went up quick. Had an old-fashioned barn raising for it." He chuckled. "The inside was the tricky part that only I could do," he said as they walked. Anne could feel the presence of the tall longhouse on the one side and another house on the other. "It did not, however, take any time out of my pet project." He grinned. "I'm almost sad to see it done," he added with a sigh. Then Bethany let go of her arm and set it on her back instead, giving her a light push forward, while she and Danny stood back and watched her. Anne started to turn to ask what was going on when she saw the edge of a stone wall around the corner of whatever building they were beside. She closed her mouth and kept walking, her curiosity piqued. The short wall continued to a small gate which she stopped before, drawn to it like she had been drawn to few things in her life. Capine, resting lightly in her hand, told her, "Here," with no question of what she meant. Anne's hand rose and came down with a sharp tack on the ground by the gate, marking the location. Tears of wonder and joy filled her eyes. Rising beyond the small gate, at the end of a little garden path, was a small stone cottage, built in the style of Irish houses that was old when she was young. The whole building screamed home to her. There were vines climbing up the side of the wall that did not look like ivy, and the front yard, though small, had empty beds set by, waiting for whatever she would choose to plant come spring. "Go on in. It'll never be locked to you," Danny encouraged her from behind. She set her hand on the gate and felt it want to open to her. She heard her boot heels click softly on the paving stones that glittered in the sunlight. It crossed her mind that they would glow under the moon. The door was thick oak, oiled and polished to bring out the character of the wood while protecting it from the elements. It was bound in scrolled brass. She reached up to touch the shining metal, felt the warmth of the sun on it. "Sorry about the brass," Danny said. "Iron would have been a bad idea, all things considered. You'll have to be careful of the shillelagh. In any case, you won't need it inside. I set up a stand for it to keep the tap off the floor." Almost without thinking about it, she slid the shillelagh further up in her grip, holding it at the halfway point. She reached for the latch and the door opened under her hand. The smell inside was inviting, new, and magical. She stepped inside and Capine pulled her hand out towards a corner where a small stand waited. The moment the tip touched the bottom, the stand vanished from On's sight, but nothing else happened. The knob rested against the corner and became still. On turned her attention to the rest of the house. Next to the stand was a bench-styled coat rack, the likes of which she had only seen in the Lord's house when she had gone with her father to pay the rent. There was a bench with a chest under the seat for one's boots and shoes. There was a mirror set between 2 rows of pegs for coats, cloaks, and hats, and a shelf for gloves and other small things. The room itself was not large by modern standards, but enormous to her for the needs of one person. It was only a little smaller than her bedroom at the manor had been. There was a fireplace, and a stuffed chair in the style she found so comfortable. There was a small table at the right height to the chair for tea or books, with a place underneath for her crochet and lacework. There was a single window overlooking the front garden, with a nice view of the gate, with dainty eyelet linen curtains. The small kitchen was not completely separate from the main room, with its own window over the small porcelain sink. There was a stove of a kind she was unfamiliar with, which Danny took a moment to explain, as well as a refrigerator, which he didn't have to. There was a small table in the kitchen, just large enough for 2 people, with a single chair, and there was a door next to the cupboards by the sink. She made the mistake of glancing out the window over the basin, and was surprised to be able to see more outside. She went to open the door and was startled again to note that the door was in 2 halves. Before she could actually open it, Danny called her away. "Come see this first. The garden last," he suggested. She looked at him, saw that glimmer in his eye that she knew was why Ian had refused to tell him the house wasn't needed. She nodded and came to him, was pleased to note that although there was only the one window in the front room and the kitchen window, the chamber was fairly bright and airy. She suddenly knew that if she wanted it darker, it would be. She smiled. She should not have been surprised. The house was a magical thing. Of course it would talk to her like everything else. She also knew without being told that subtle changes would occur according to her needs, more easily if she was in direct contact with things in the house. She took the hint that bare feet were preferred. Danny was holding open a second door near the fireplace. On drifted past him into the small bedroom. This room was filled with light. The walls were painted a pale, silvery white with just a hint of blue to it. There was a tall brass bed under the window, which was set high enough that she would have to sit up to see out properly, but would afford her a nice view of the night sky if she wanted when she lay down. The bed was dressed in white eyelet and crisp, soft linens over a deep feather mattress. The night table had a single lamp and a book on it, with a small drawer for necessaries. There was a modest dressing table in a nearly white wood that proclaimed itself made of holly. It had an oval mirror, a matching chair, and a wardrobe beside it. There was a fireplace, smaller than the one it backed, but more than adequate to keep her warm if it ever turned cold, something she was seriously beginning to doubt would ever happen. There was a single door in the room other than the bedroom door, which opened into a small water closet with a dainty sink and appropriate facilities. Danny grimaced as she looked in, apologizing profusely. "I tried to put in a bath or a shower, but the house wouldn't let me," he pouted. She smiled, her hand on the doorframe as she closed the door again. "It will provide when I want one." He brightened. "Really? I was hoping that were the case, but I wish I could talk to things like you do." She shrugged. "There might be a way. What one gentry grants as a gift, I am sure could be acquired by another somehow." "I'll ask the witch," he said, nodding. "She'll know. Maybe I'll find it at the goblin market. It'd be easier to get to near Samhain." On frowned. Beware the goblin markets. He waved off her concern. "Oh, I know. I goes there often enough. I'm getting better. The witch might get a better deal, though," he mused. Suddenly he looked up. "Oh, there's one thing I forgot." He took her hand and pulled her back through to the front room. Bethany was poking through the pantry, taking note of what would be needed, and was surprised to find nearly everything one could want. She looked up as Danny dragged On to the fourth door in the room, the one opposite the fireplace next to the coat rack. Danny presented the door as if it were his grandest achievement. On looked at it, found it rather nondescript. She looked back at him, watched him deflate. He waved his hand at it. "Touch it. Ask it what it does." On raised her hand, caressing the polished wood. Immediately she saw what she had to do to whatever door she desired. Once done, from then on, but only when she willed it, that door would open to this door, much like the door between the warehouse and the one under Ian's stair. She smiled. "Thank you," she said, to both Danny and to the house. Now she had a reason to keep the house, and it would not sit abandoned for too long. She had the feeling it wouldn't like being left alone. "I will just have to figure out how to get the alarms to alert me here." "I'm sure there's a way," Danny said dismissively. "Would you like to see the garden now?" She turned to the now open door, felt almost drawn to it. The back was decidedly bigger than the front. The wall ran all the way to the bottom of the garden, which was fairly deep, and sloped gently down to a stream that ran under the walls with a pretty little footbridge. There was a small orchard of about 8 trees, a pair of apples, pears, peaches, a walnut, and a pecan. There were some late-blooming roses along one part of the wall, a profusion of reds and pinks. One smaller, more straggly bush caught her eye, a little further down the wall from the others. Its blooms were a deep yellow, though they looked wilted and drooped. Danny followed her eye. "I took the liberty of having some of this cultivated for you, to get you started. Literally liberty. She's the reason you can see it all. That one over there," he said, seeing where her attention was, "it kinda turned up. Liberty hasn't been able to do anything with it. Thought you might like to try your hand. I got places for a vegetable patch if you like, and ready spots along the walls for those berries you mentioned. Just let me know whatever you want to get. I can manage just about anything." Bethany interrupted him. "Liberty might be the better choice for getting seeds and seedlings. She is the one with the green thumb, after all." Danny nodded. Right. He pulled out his watch, flipped it open, and consulted it. He snapped it closed and back into his pocket in one smooth motion. "Well, we're just right out of time. Gotta get back. Car's waiting." Danny led them around the house along the side yard, and On was pleased to note that the wall was only a little higher than a yard, and made with good stone, only trimmed as necessary. It did not take long to walk through the lush grass to the front walk, where On paused to look back at the house. She smiled, feeling the welcome in her bones. The house closed itself up, and the gate opened for her. Capine stood waiting for her against the outside of the wall. She took her up and followed Danny to what she could tell was a waiting car. Before she got inside, she bent and gave Danny a kiss on the cheek. "Thank you," she said. "Deeply. I thank you." He blushed into the collar of his shirt, pleased as Punch. When On returned to the manor, the festivities were just getting under way. There were only a few others coming in still, carrying their potlucks. Kegs were being broached, and the tables were laden with food. The band was tuning up, and people were beginning to laugh and mingle. Liberty and the twins met her at the porch, grinning. "Like it?" On beamed. "I love it." "Danny tell you you're right next door to me?" On glanced over at Danny, who had the decency to look sheepish. "No, he didn't. I have figured out that the building on the other side is Sky's longhouse." Liberty laughed. "He's calling it his mead hole. Swears it still suits, even though 'tis mostly for training." Sky came up from the tables with a plate of food. "Though I still expect you to make an appearance there now and again for training. You're going to get involved like last week. I want to be comfortable that wasn't a lucky crack." She nodded, taking her usual stance with Capine on the ground before her and both hands resting lightly on the knob. "Very well. I'm off Sundays, and if nothing else happens by Samhain, I'll have 2 days. I'll take 'em both." Liberty popped his arm hard enough to make him have to scramble to keep from losing his plate. He cried out more in surprise than pain, though it hurt. He rubbed his arm with his free hand. "You'll take what she gives you, lummox. Chances are she's got things she'd rather do with her days off than take a beating from you." "Like what?" Liberty fixed him with a withering stare. "Nonya!" she snapped. She turned sweetly to On. "Will you mind coming over to my house Sunday for lunch? We'll work out things before supper." On smiled mischievously, remembering what things must be. "Aye, I see no problem with it." Roulette and Solitaire came over and took On's arm, leading her off into the crowd, leaving Liberty to deal with Sky. Then Solitaire saw someone she wanted to talk to and wandered off in another direction without a word. "Ingenious, with the ribbons," Anne said. "Glad you like it. It looks good to normalize, too, so no one's complaining." The whole event had the feel of a town fair. Children ran in and out among adults, laughing and playing their boisterous games. There were places where folk were cooking over an open fire or in covered smokers, handing out chunks and slices of various meats as they were done, and ears of roasted corn hot on the cob. Corn was something Anne had gotten used to eating at the Tallows. She wasn't used to people eating it. It was animal feed. She was pleased to discover what she had been missing out on, for the corn here was sweet and flavorful. The ritual was short and to the point. Just before the sun began to set, Henry carried a whole, freshly killed deer to the altar that had been set up, and Liberty carried a basket of grain, fruits, vegetables, and flowers. The holly in Henry's antlers were full of ripening berries, and Liberty's crown was full of asters and roses and other late-blooming flowers. Her leaves were beginning to change colors, and there were sprays of barley and wheat among them. As night fell, the pair led a procession followed by a group carrying a straw man. Everyone else followed in their wake. Once the man was bound to the stake in the midst of the bonfire, Fox stepped forward and made a great show of breathing fire on the torch Liberty held out. Henry then took the torch and set the wood ablaze. Anne watched the torch come to light, gazed with fascination as the fire began to spread. She could not see what was burning, but every tongue of flame, every glowing coal, was bright and alive to her eyes. She saw the straw man come to life, even as he died in a blaze of red and orange. Some people danced around the bonfire, Liberty and Henry included, at least until the straw man was gone. Even Roulette and her sister joined in, from opposite sides of the fire, but they spun and cavorted in opposite directions, linking arms and reversing when they met. It was not long before a great wheel had begun around the fire, with people joining in that had previously abstained. They danced in 2 rows in opposite directions, as the twins did, but linking arms with the next person coming at them, passing themselves along from one person to another. Even Anne let herself be pulled into it, trusting those she could not see to take her arm and pull her along when she held it out. When the straw man collapsed into the body of the fire, there was a shout, and the dancers came to a halt, some of them falling in a heap, laughing and trying to overcome their dizziness. Roulette found Anne again after she untangled herself from the heap she had ended up in, and took her back by the buffet tables, making sure she ate and drank something. When Anne asked where her sister was, she grinned. "Trying to keep Henry from getting his antlers untangled." "Should we... keep him tangled?" Roulette laughed. "Yeah, she's the one who tangled him up. And her skirts. Come on, they're starting over at the bandstand, and I want to dance some more. But we need to eat a bit first." She was a little disappointed when Anne got her drink from the children's selection, but she said nothing, respecting Anne's choice to remain dry. She guessed the blind could ill afford the loss of equilibrium. The band was in full swing when they came to the well-trampled green. Anne let herself be pulled into one of the great reels that she remembered from her youth, where the whole dance floor moved in wheels and patterns, changing partners frequently. She enjoyed herself, pleased that there was something familiar here for her. They began the wild horse stomp, and she threw herself into it. The men and women lined up in opposite lines, each taking their turns at the dance, the women prancing prettily as they turned, and the men pawing the earth with their feet before they cut the steps. Then the pairs linked hands, trotting several strides, first one way and then the other, then lifting their arms high for the couple at the end of the line to run through to the head and rejoin. The dancers separated and spun in place, each line taking steps to the right, switching partners, and the luckless guy on the end, now partnerless, having to run all the way down to even out the lines and pick up a new partner. The entire dance went on in this riotous fashion until the dancers were worn out or were back to their original partners. Anne ended up paired with a great many mortals, and more than a few touched, including Ian and Skye at one point. Anne had just run through the gauntlet with Peter, the mortal who had tangled with the coup in front of the Tallows, when the partner change left her in front of Johnny Sorrow. Her heart stopped, and it was all she could do to remember the steps expected of her. When he took her hands and they began the trot left, instead of reversing and returning to the right, he kept them going left until they were off the dancing green. He pulled her with him as he turned away from the dancing and the crowd completely, leading her away from everyone. She didn't know why, but she let him, too startled and flustered to protest. He slowed when the noise level died down. From what she could tell, they were in a garden she had not encountered before. She could see there were decorative hedges from the strings of phthalites someone had draped them with. He brought her to a halt at a small bower with a trellis arching overhead, wrapped in roulette's red streamers. Anne looked around nervously. She could still hear people not far away, on two sides, near enough to distinguish parts of loud conversations, and she could see glimpses of some of the touch over the hedge, so she deemed herself uncompromised. He set her down on the bench and sat beside her, her hand still resting lightly on his, as he leaned back against the wood of the bench. "I'm sorry about that," he said. "We can go back if you like, when you've caught your breath. But you said we might talk." His eyes said she hadn't resisted, though he was hoping she would not now that she had the chance. She shifted in her seat a bit, turning a little to face him. She blushed when her knee touched his, but did not move for fear of calling attention to it. She did, however, slip her hand from his and into her lap. I did." He took it as encouragement and gave her a sad smile. She just sat there and breathed for a moment. She was acutely aware of his nearness and his elven masculinity. He smelled of snow and winter air and sleeping earth. There were notes of mellow smoke and a touch of whiskey, all of it putting her at ease and on edge at the same breath for very different reasons. Eventually, he rescued her. "And how have you found the evening so far?" he asked softly, his voice like the landing of snowflakes. "Fair. It has been exhilarating. Oddly freeing." One white eyebrow arched over his earth-brown eye, and there was a hint of amusement about his perfect lips. It only served to make her feel more plain compared to him. "Oh? A chance to let your hair down?" He reached out and caught a lock around his finger at her temple, delicately coiling it behind her ear and draping it down the front of her vest. "I like it down. But out of your face." She blushed, tipping her head so that the other side fell across her cheek, obscuring one mist-filled eye. "My eyes disturb some folk. I find them beautiful." As if he realized it was a tender subject, he changed it, fingering the white-on-white embroidery at her wrist, running his finger over her pulse point as if unaware of what it would do to her. "This is beautiful. Elven work, that. Cobweb silk is rare this side." Glad of something safe to discuss, she focused on the delicate lace at the cuff. "The princess made it for me, for my 100th year." They were interrupted by a mortal couple running past them, giggling and excusing themselves when they found the bower occupied. "Glad they found one another," he said softly. "Who?" she asked, confused. He smiled, nodded in their direction. "They've started closing up to each other since the wake. Mayhap they'll post their banns in spring, parents willin'." She gave a soft chuckle. "Not much has changed from the old country." "Not here." "Out there," he said, waving his hand towards the distant outside world. "Life certainly has moved on. But they do things differently, and I don't completely understand it. One of the reasons I stay here. Venture out only on specific days." "What do you do with yourself?" she asked, suddenly curious. He shrugged. "I have my work for the chief, for the rest. I'm one of the dreamwalkers. I've learned the fairy dreamin'. I also teach and entertain as I should as bard. And when the chief calls, I act the scout when 'tis fitting." He paused as they could hear Solitaire and Henry chasing each other at the next hedge over. He took her hand up again. "Perhaps this wasn't the best place for this conversation. More like not the best night. These events do seem to bring out the... She blushed. He nodded. "I know what you mean." He turned to look over the hedge behind him, to determine how close they were to the rutting activity he was sure was about to commence. "Perhaps we should..." They were interrupted again, this time by Raven, who landed in bird form on the edge of the bower, bent to look in, then jumped to the ground, shifting back into a girl before she landed. "Hey! Sorry, been looking. You said..." She gushed, pausing finally when she saw who else was there. Anne sighed, knowing she would be hounded until she read the ring, held out her hand. "Gave it..." Raven brightened, pulled the ring from her finger and placed it on Anne's bare palm. As her fingers curled around the warm metal, it grew warmer, and her mind was flooded with images so real she could feel the flames that licked up from the coals beneath her and began to melt her human body down to base metal. The pain was intense, pulsing, real enough to make her scream in a rising pitch that seemed to have no end. Her actual body writhed on the bench as the hammer came down, pounding her into the desired form. The ringing pain seemed to go on forever, blow upon blow until she was right. Then she was cast into the ocean deep to cool for an eternity. Skye was by the drink table, hefting a new barrel onto the pouring stand when the scream rang out in the night. It ran through his blood like ice. It was the same voice as the Fae would, but the sound was different. The sound was agony, not terror. He dropped the keg and tore off towards the lover's maze, kilt flying. Others were running, but he passed most of them, bowled through those he could not go around quickly enough. As he ran down the hedgerow, his sword fell into his hand. He came around the corner and saw the bower, Ann's rigid body arcing off the bench, her lungs sucking unsuccessfully for air, her fist clenched in front of her, and Johnny on his knees before her, trying to pry her fist open. Raven fluttered, terrified, just back from them. He hesitated, not sure what to do or make of the situation. Then Sorrow had the fist open and pulled a ring from it, casting it away from her, and Raven dove to pick it up. Skye let his sword go and came closer, aware that others were joining them. Ann was still not breathing and fighting to do so. Sorrow laid his hands on her, frost creeping up her arms and over her chest from his touch. Skye started to surge forward, but a burst of ozone near him and a hand on his arm stopped him. Johnny had a helpless look on his face, as whatever he was doing did not seem to be working. A long, hard gasp came from her as she reached out, flailing like the drowned for something to pull her out. She found Johnny's hand and seized on it, clinging desperately. For a brief moment she smiled, and Skye noticed that she wrapped her whole hand around the ring finger of Johnny's right hand. Then, just as suddenly, she was sobbing in his arms, pressed to his chest, her hands clutching the ragged denim of his patchwork vest, moaning, "No more, please. Not another one. Not another. Not another." Another minute passed and she began to tremble, her sobs growing more quiet and eventually ending. Skye was aware of Liberty behind him, beginning to shoo people away. Ann took a deep breath, opening her eyes to find herself on the grass in Johnny's arms. Skye was looming near, looking ready to draw his sword against something. He just didn't seem sure what. Liberty was just behind him, and Raven had shifted to bird and was sitting on a branch with a worried look in her black eye. Self-conscious, Ann loosened her grip on Johnny's vest, smoothing it out where she had creased it, blushing at the wet spot she found. Her hands went to his muscled arms as he stood, drawing her up with him and guiding her back to the bench. He knelt again in front of her, not letting go of her. "Are you all right now?" he asked softly. She took another trembling breath before nodding. "What did you see? If you can stand to tell," he added. I saw..." Her voice sounded hollow to her ears, as if she had been crying for hours and she felt wrung out. "It was a person, man or woman I dinna ken, but it was melted down in a furnace, a forge, I think, hammered into a ring. I was thrown into the ocean to temper, left forever." A tiny, lost sound escaped her throat. "Then she reached in and pulled me out again, put me on the hand of a little girl. It was a promise, she said, the bond between them. So long as the child always loved her mother, they were bound. Oh God," she gasped. "Her love is so deep, so fierce. It's obsession, all-consuming. You're fine as long as there is no room in your heart for another, though she herself loves many. Her love burns," she whispered, closing her eyes and shuddering. "Then something happened. The child, she stopped loving her, and another little girl came along and killed her, and the ring, I was put on the new little girl, and then another, and then another. I thought there would be no end." She looked over Johnny's shoulder at Raven, her eyes burning. "You were the last. And so long as you love your mother, she'll leave you be, though she wants you home." She shook her head, answering the question in Raven's face. "I don't know what else it does. I'll not touch it again." Skye was afraid to ask, so whispered to Liberty. "Who's she?" "The Northerner," she said flatly. He stiffened, clenched his fist until his joints cracked. Liberty flinched, and he stopped. Johnny stood. "All right, I think it's time to get you home." He helped her to her feet, then swept her up into his arms, an act which startled a squeak out of her. From over her shoulder at the top of the trellis, they heard Raven's voice croak a quiet, "I'm sorry," before flying off. Johnny turned to face Liberty. "Where am I taking her, Miss O'Keefe?" She took charge immediately. "Home. The cottage next to my house. He nodded. By the training hall or the other side? In between them. With that, Johnny turned and began walking deeper into the lover's maze. Kippeen, Anne protested. I left her by the bandstand. Got it, came a voice she did not see, and then there came the burn of ozone. Feeling weaker than she had after the fight with the Fomor in the Griffin King's wood, Anne surrendered to being carried, putting her arms around his neck to make it easier for him. She felt fevered and relished the cool touch of his neck against her forehead. Skye watched them go, started to follow, but Liberty's arms stopped him. Do you want her for yourself? He thought about that, jaw tensing. He stared into her eyes, felt lost and unsettled. He looked after the white hair disappearing into the dark and thought about Anne's eyes, what he'd felt looking into them. It wasn't like this. He felt something, but not this. One of the men in the camp had commented just before the parley that it was a shame the governess had lost her eyes, as they were the only beautiful thing about her. But he didn't see that. He saw a different beauty, something more lasting. And that something was not for him. He looked back down at Liberty's glittering greens and sighed, crossing his arms. Nay. Her hand grew gentle on his arm. Then let her have her chance. Who knows? I'm still responsible, he insisted. She smiled at him. And you live next door. We can check up on her when you take me home, just after I tell Da what happened. She gestured off after the Raven girl. He's going to need to know about her in any case. She slipped her hand under his arm into the crook of his elbow and made him turn back towards the manor and escort her to the main house. Johnny carried her slight weight with ease through the wood, and Anne allowed herself to take comfort in his strength, even as she fretted over the embarrassment of the need. The wood was mostly dark, but there were dapplings of moonlight through the thinning leaves. The light breeze that sprang up as they left the shelter of the trees was deliciously cool, far more in keeping with her preference in weather. The day had been too warm for her tastes, and if the night had been as hot as the last, she wasn't sure if she could have withstood it in her current condition. Johnny found his way down the path to the cul-de-sac. There were several plots there, some standing empty. Directly across from him was a lot with a fence around it and a large Romany wagon sitting prettily in the middle. Beside that was a modern 2-story house, and the mead hall stood to his immediate left. He turned towards Liberty's large 2-story affair and did not need to see roulette glittering at the gate and the little stone wall beside it to know which was the right house. She opened the gate for them, stood there holding Kippeen patiently. How is she? She asked Johnny. Well enough to answer for myself, thank you, Anne snapped, though her voice sounded weak even to her. Sorry, love. You look so pale in this light I thought you were asleep, she said, reaching out to touch her cheek tenderly. Johnny turned in the gate and strode down the path to the door. Anne took note that the paving stones did indeed fair glow by moonlight. The door swung open as they approached, and Anne sat up a little straighter in his arms. I'll thank you to let me cross my threshold on my own. With a wry look in his moon-darkened eye, he nodded and set her to her feet, though he did not let her go until he was certain she was stable. She seemed to be, mounted the first step on her own, then staggered against the doorframe. He grabbed her again, though this time he just let her lean on him, helped her into the house. Roulette followed them in, setting Kippeen in her stand, and turned to assist. There was a fire crackling merrily in the grate, and the green damask wingback chair placed perfectly in front of it. Johnny took her over to the chair and eased her into it. She winced as she sat, surprised at how tender she felt at the moment, as if she had truly been burnt and not just experienced the memory of it, however vivid. Johnny hovered by the arm of the chair, reluctant to leave her. Can I get you anything? Take care of anything for you? He asked in his soft voice. I'll be fine. I just need a cup of tea and I'll go to bed, she breathed. Roulette started for the kitchen to get the tea when there was a tiny rattle of porcelain at Anne's elbow. All three of them looked to find a delicate cup of Irish porcelain steaming fragrantly on the tiny table. Anne smiled gratefully and picked it up, sipping it. It had just the right amount of honey in it, the perfect blend of bite and sweet. "'Tis a marvellous house you have here, Ceolbranach," he said appreciatively. She smiled. "I've Daniel O'Keefe to thank for that, though I'm sure I'll find there are house spirits to tend to matters in my absence. I think it'll handle any need but taking my boots off." Johnny started to move to offer and stopped himself. He took her hand instead, placing a light, cool kiss across her slim fingers. "Until later, then." Our conversation can wait. Roulette, will you stay and help her to bed? He asked, looking up at the gypsy woman. I'll take care of it, no worries, she smiled. He looked back down at On. I'll leave you then. Until Keobranuk. He held her eyes almost longer than necessary, then turned and left the house. Roulette approached her chair. Can I get you anything? She asked. The look in her eye and the tone of her voice told On that she thought her a fool for turning the man away. I would appreciate help with my boots, she said first. Then, as Roulette bent and began to unlace the old-fashioned, suede leather boots, she answered her disapproval. I am not a modern woman, Roulette. I don't fall into bed with any man who catches my interest. Roulette slipped the first shoe off, and On sighed with relief. She had not realized how uncomfortable they had gotten until they were off. From what I hear, a Celtic woman could sleep with any man she fancied, even once she married. And a man is afforded the same. On gave a wrung-out laugh. I am a contradiction, love. I was raised Irish Catholic in Victorian Ireland. Modesty and chastity alongside the Celtic virtues of loyalty, generosity, and vengeance. I watched the Tuatha live by the old ways. Even their people, who are not all my people, some of them embraced it. But I've never... I find it hard... She sighed as the other boot came off, and Roulette began to rub her stockinged foot. To change that. A blind eye is turned when a man strays, but women must remain chaste and true, or be considered loose and of less worth. I can't imagine being a 150-year-old virgin, she grimaced. No offence. None taken, dear. One can't miss what one hasn't had. My job requires propriety. I'll hold to my virtue. I'm just glad the weather's turning finally and I can wear proper shoes. I was feeling a bit the harlot with my ankles bare to the world. Roulette chuckled, held up On's foot, turning it slightly one way then another. I suppose there is something to be said for a glimpse of the forbidden. Like the song says, a glimpse of stocking was something shocking. Now heaven knows, anything goes. That's a song? She asked over the last sip of her tea. Would you like me to sing it for you? I think I would. But I would also like to go to bed. Here, I'll help with that, Roulette said, getting up. She helped On out of the chair, was not happy to find how difficult it was, how stiff On had gotten. Are you sure you're all right? I can do some of the healing like Liberty, just not as much. She smiled, accepting her help towards the open bedroom door. Well, I'm sure that is apt to be a shocking experience. I don't think my pains are real. I felt everything that poor soul went through before it became that ring. And before you ask, no, I don't think it can be made human again. There's nothing human left. Roulette got On into her room and helped her into the nightgown that lay waiting on the bed. She sang the song Anything Goes by Cole Porter for her as she brushed out On's hair. The thick waves of amber were soft, and Roulette found it a delight to play with. It was almost sad to have to stop and braid it up. She pulled down the covers and helped On into the tall bed, tucking her in. On stopped her with a hand on hers before she moved away. I want to thank you for everything today. Liberty, too. I owe the family so much. I love my house. You're too good to me, and I'm such a trial. Roulette pressed a kiss to her forehead. Nonsense. Now go to sleep. You've earned it. As she moved away from the bed, she paused to check the fireplace, to bank the fire, and found it set for the night. She slipped out of the bedroom and softly closed the door behind her. She went to collect the teacup and the boots to put them away and found them gone. She said softly. Either you've got yourself a brownie on, love, or your house really likes you. Behind her, the fire began to slowly die down, faster than it should, and she took that as a hint to be on her way. She paused on the threshold and said to the house at large, Remind me not to get on your bad side.